Early September, October 31st, 1943. At the beginning of September, the 58th Division received orders to prepare to transfer 40 miles westward from the fiercely contested Ladoga area to the relative calm of the Oranienbaum pocket, roughly 2 years after our previous posting there. Before making the shift to a new position, a Vorkommando would be sent ahead to determine the placement of the guns and other equipment. As a recently promoted sergeant, I was assigned to head the team by our company commander, 2nd Lieutenant Reichardt. On September 8th, the day before the remainder of the division arrived, I wrote a letter to Annalisa describing the view from our new location near the coast. I can see the Baltic Sea, the towers of Leningrad, and the hills of Finland. In the midst of a conversation with Reichardt the day after my letter, he abruptly asked, "Do you want to be an officer?" Though it had been apparent that he had been grooming me for greater responsibility, the sudden question still caught me off guard. Despite my surprise, I responded instantly with an enthusiastic, "Jawohl, Herr Leutnant." With my acceptance, I became an officer candidate, finally earning the chance to pursue a leadership role to which I had long aspired. 2 days later, on September 11th, Colonel Behrend, our regimental commander, decorated me with the Iron Cross First Class for bravery, in recognition of my role in halting the tank attack near the Neva River, as well as a number of other combat actions. In our company, the Iron Cross First Class was awarded to only a few soldiers, so it was a distinct honour that I felt privileged to wear. Excited to share my news, I decided to try to give Annalisa a phone call from my frontline bunker at Oranienbaum. Since the communications network was restricted to military needs, I was aware that my effort might be blocked, but figured it was worth a try. Using our field telephone, I reached the regimental switchboard and was patched through to the division. The divisional operator, in turn, placed a call to the hospital in St. Peter-Ording, where Annalisa was working. Much to my disappointment, I learned that she was already off duty that day. I tried to phone her again, but never reached her. My failure to speak to her left me even more anxious to see her again. Before entering a military academy back in Germany, officer candidates had to fulfill a short tour of duty in charge of an infantry squad. On September 18th, I was assigned temporary command of a squad of about a dozen soldiers in one of the regular infantry companies, comprised mostly of men from the Hamburg area. Removed from my familiar role and comrades, this new assignment placed me in a role for which I felt unprepared, among soldiers I did not know. Naturally, I greeted the task without much enthusiasm, but accepted it as a necessary step in the process of becoming an officer. Larger events soon took us into action. Intelligence in early October revealed that the Soviets were massing 2 armies before the German front at Nevel, located about 150 miles south of Leningrad. As the junction point between Army Group North and Army Group Centre, it was a particularly vital sector of the front. Responding to this imminent threat, the High Command directed additional forces to the Nevel area from across the northern front, including the 58th Division. Together with the rest of the 154th Regiment's infantry, my squad spent October 2nd to October 6th aboard trains on a circuitous 300-mile journey south from Oranienbaum. The expected Russian offensive commenced on October 6th and quickly broke through at the seam of the 2 German army groups. The newly arriving 58th Division played a key role in halting the enemy's advance just north of Nevel, but its hastily organised counterattack was unable to regain control of the town. When the train carrying my infantry squad and other elements of the 154th Regiment reached the Nevel area, we joined the desperate fight. After the infantry company's commander outlined my assignment on a map, I met with my men to explain what we could expect as we moved into our frontline position. Listen closely. This hill ahead of us is under Russian fire. When we reach the top of it, the Russians will be able to see us. Get over the top and onto the other side where we'll have cover again. Shouting, "Auf geht's!" Let's go. I led them forward. Advancing over the treeless crest of the hill, we immediately encountered machine gun fire and dashed for cover at the bottom. Given our vulnerability in this situation, I was relieved to execute the mission with only 1 wounded man. Upon reaching our front line, I instructed my squad to dig trenches and haul up logs to create a rampart. In the midst of constructing these defences, a group of several German Stuka dive bombers appeared up in the sky. With sudden alarm, we watched as they began to plummet toward us. Gaining speed in their descent, the sirens mounted under their wings screeched louder and louder. The planes were coming right at us. Only at the last minute did they veer off to deliver their bombs on an enemy target about 150 yards to the front of our trenches. A short time after we took up our post, a flock of sheep wandered into the no-man's land running between the German and Soviet lines. In the fading light just before sundown, one of the men in my squad brought down one of the sheep with his rifle. Once it was dark, a couple of my men hauled the lamb back into our lines, where it was skinned and roasted over an open fire. Having gone without fresh meat for a long time, we all savoured a rare feast of mutton. Our satisfaction did not last long. Apparently, the meat was cooked inadequately. Everyone in my squad soon began to experience stomach cramps and had to run for the bushes. At the end of my own 2-week bout of diarrhea, I swore an oath to myself that I would never touch mutton again. Because of casualties suffered by the infantry company's officers in the intense combat, I was shortly assigned the command of a full platoon of roughly 36 men. Lacking bunkers in which to take shelter, we huddled in our holes in the already freezing weather. During a firefight on October 12th, a bullet passed through the left arm of my overcoat. While only slightly grazing my skin, the injury nonetheless required me to seek first aid and bandages from our medic, temporarily pulling me off the front line. With a brief moment to contact Annalisa, I penned a letter. The following line conveys the extent to which my feelings for her sustained me. It is because of your existence and love that life in combat here on the Eastern Front is made bearable. After a couple of days back up at the front with the infantry platoon, new orders arrived on October 16th, reassigning the infantry command to someone else and directing me to remain in the rear area. Running increasingly short of officers, the Army perhaps took this measure as part of its larger effort to ensure that officer candidates would not die in battle just before returning to Germany for training at one of the 5 Kriegsschulen, war academies. Though my brief stint in command of regular infantry troops proved a positive experience, there had not been enough time for us to develop any sort of bond. While the troops treated me with the respect due anyone superior in rank, they were otherwise indifferent to me. Likewise, I felt little personal attachment to them and missed my old comrades back in the 13th Company. Working as a forward observer gave me a greater sense of responsibility, knowing that the whole regiment was depending on my skills to provide them with fire support from our heavy guns. On October 17th, I received orders from Colonel Berend to attend a 10-day course. Conducted a few miles behind the front lines, it was designed to help prepare officer candidates who would soon be entering a Kriegsschule. Having obtained the official status of Fähnrich, junior officer candidate, I finally departed Russia on October 31st for the long train trip back to Germany. To defend against attack by Soviet partisan forces, the front and rear rail cars of the train were mounted with light anti-aircraft guns. Although sabotage of the railroad tracks along our route delayed the trip a couple of times, we otherwise crossed through occupied Soviet territory without encountering significant partisan activity. Despite the interference with its logistics that the German army faced from enemy partisans, most of the time our division did not have much difficulty obtaining supplies at the front. The worst supply problems had actually resulted from the weather during the bitterly cold winter of 1941-1942. Since that time, the Wehrmacht had succeeded in adequately meeting our needs for food, ammunition, and other essential supplies. Even letters and parcels from home arrived promptly. Although we did not notice any change in the availability of our supplies at the front, soldiers returning from leave in 1943 began to report that the partisans were becoming a significant problem in rear areas. They eventually grew so powerful that the German army deployed whole divisions behind the lines to conduct counterinsurgency operations to secure the rail links to our army at the front. Even with these efforts, the partisans frequently succeeded in disrupting our rail network and impeding the movement of troops and supplies. Up at the front, we placed a large part of the blame for the growing problem with the partisans on the brutal way the General Commissariat, Nazi political officials, ran the occupation behind us. These Nazis in the General Commissariat were known as Goldfasanen, golden pheasants, because of the golden-brown colour of their party uniforms and their arrogant and corrupt misrule. Most of the German soldiers around me felt a deep bitterness at the suffering that these Goldfasanen intentionally and unnecessarily inflicted on the Soviet civilian population. This ideologically inspired cruelty led many of the occupied peoples that had once welcomed us as liberators to shift their support to the partisans working for a communist victory. October 31st, December 7th, 1943. Because my orders did not immediately require me to report to the 58th Division's reserve base in Oldenburg, Anneliese and I had made plans to spend 4 days together in St. Peter, Ording in Schleswig-Holstein, where she had been posted as a nurse. On November 3rd, I finally reached the small town and took a hotel room. Despite windy, cold and wet weather that time of year, Anneliese and I still enjoyed strolling around the scenic resort area and watching the waves crash against the coast. After all we had been through during the previous 6 months apart, we were simply happy to have time together again. On November 8th, I returned south to the reserve base in Oldenburg, which served as the 58th Infantry Division's primary processing centre for soldiers departing and returning from the front. There was little for me to do, but Anneliese was able to follow me down from St. Peter, Ording for a 2-day visit. Just after she returned to St. Peter, Ording, Anneliese began experiencing stomach pains and underwent an emergency appendectomy on November 17th at a hospital in Tonning near St. Peter. Ording. Before returning home to Puggen for my 3-week furlough before the start of my training at the Kriegsschule, I made a trip up to Tonning to spend a little time with her in the hospital. Reaching home the next day, my family gave me their usual warm welcome. As always, my sisters wanted me to carry them on my back and play games with them. Despite such light moments, it was clear to me that life in Germany was growing harder. Beginning in the winter of 1943-1944, the local authorities required children to bring a piece of peat coal to class each day in order to help heat Puggen's one-room schoolhouse. If the supplies ran out, my sisters and the other students would have to bundle up in their coats throughout the day to stay warm. By this time, Marlene had completed her elementary schooling and had entered an upper-level school in nearby Salzwedel, where her main teacher was a strong Nazi. Aware of our family's lack of support for the Nazis, this teacher caused Marlene many difficulties, especially for her failure to use the Heil Hitler salute in which the arm is thrust out. Politically handicapped and under constant scrutiny, Marlene had to work extremely hard to achieve a measure of academic success. Her experience reflected the broader treatment that my family received because of its unfavourable attitude toward the Nazis. For example, when my family sought permission to butcher one of our pigs, it encountered problems obtaining authorization from the local farmer who had been granted such decision-making powers because of his Nazi loyalty. Likewise, when the higher authorities issued a directive requiring Puggen to supply a certain number of animals for slaughter or horses for transportation, this same Nazi farmer made sure that my family was the first one required to surrender the necessary livestock. In other ways, my family's experience was typical of that of other German families. Like many of them, my parents risked losing more than one son in the war. Earlier that year, the army had drafted my younger brother, Otto. When he completed his basic training, he was stationed with an infantry division in northern France, in the area south of Normandy. Because his twin Hans had suffered a childhood accident in which a wagon wheel ran over his left leg, he was unable to serve at the front, despite his desire to do so. When we were away at the front, my mother would anxiously await letters from Otto or me each day. While eager to hear more news on the military situation, my mother did not trust the information presented by the tightly controlled German media. Although risking harsh punishment for tuning into enemy broadcasts, she would regularly get out a small radio she kept hidden away and scan the dial for the BBC's distinctive classical music call sign. Though occasionally joined by other members of the family, she frequently would sit alone in a back room listening to their German language program in an effort to obtain a clearer picture of the war. Closely following military developments on a map, my mother knew where the front lines ran, and sometimes even where our divisions were operating. Upon her release from the hospital in Tonning on November 27th, Annalisa was granted leave from her nursing duties and went home to Hamburg, where I joined her for 4 days. During this visit, she arranged for me to stay with her Aunt Frieda, a sweet elderly woman who was a close friend of her father's, and who had somewhat taken on the role of mother to Annalisa since her real mother was absent. She resided in a 2-bedroom apartment in the winter-hued suburb of the city, located behind the popular delicatessen that she ran selling coffee, chocolates, and other desserts. Like Aunt Frieda's apartment, the house that Annalisa's father shared with his sisters in the suburb of Wandsbek had escaped major damage in the bombing raids, but the magnitude of the devastation in the heart of Hamburg was astonishing. In tears, Annalisa finally described her horrible recollections from the previous summer. In the aftermath of the bombings, she had only been able to reach the hospital where she had been training as a nurse with great difficulty. Once there, she treated many terribly burned civilian casualties. The giant inferno caused by the bombing had generated such intense heat that the asphalt roads had melted into a sticky tar. People trying to escape the firestorm became stuck and burned like torches. In the tragedy's grim wake, we found it difficult to appreciate fully our limited moments together. The war was now everywhere and impossible to escape. Yet, even as the situation at home and the news from the front grew more ominous, a surprising sense of optimism about the outcome of the war still prevailed among all those I knew. Goebbels' speeches promising the imminent arrival of miracle weapons, more advanced than anything Germany's enemies possessed, inspired hope that our fortunes would soon change. Puggen to commence my officer training at the Kriegsschulein, the suburbs of Dresden, on December 8th, the old Saxon city was still beautiful. There was no hint of the terrible fate that awaited Dresden later in the war, when an Allied incendiary bombing would kill about 60,000 civilians. In acknowledgement of our service at the front, the War Academy tried to make our experience as officer candidates as agreeable as possible, providing us with comfortable rooms in the barracks and good meals in the mess hall. At the same time, the Academy's staff kept us constantly busy with a variety of tasks. From morning until noon, we attended classes on leadership skills, tactics, and other military theory. Our instructors also taught military etiquette, such as proper conduct for an officer in the company of a woman and appropriate dining manners. In the afternoon, we carried out field training in the snow-covered rolling hills of the Academy's firing range at Königsbruck. Our instructors would assign us a platoon with a couple of 75mm guns in order to assess our leadership skills and our ability to handle the howitzers in a variety of offensive and defensive tactical scenarios. Because most of the soldiers we were commanding possessed frontline experience, the exercises were not too challenging. In fact, because of my years in combat as a forward observer, I was often able to pass along practical advice to the instructors. On weekday evenings, we would study in our rooms after a meal in the Academy's mess hall. Although the Academy arranged no dances or other social activities for us on weekends, I sometimes attended operas and operettas with other officer candidates at Dresden's renowned Semper Opera House. Despite increasing numbers of officers from middle-class origins, Germany's officer corps was still filled with many blue-blooded aristocrats, von so-and-so, who had been educated at the nation's elite institutions. The majority of these high-born officers were decent men who treated the other soldiers with respect, but there were a few who held very superior attitudes toward others, not of their social class. While most of the Vons were fellow Prussians, I was not from an aristocratic background, and despised those officers who treated common soldiers like myself in a condescending manner. My experiences with one particular Prussian aristocrat illustrates the character of this arrogance. The same first lieutenant who had once led his horse into our barracks at Lüneburg in a drunken display of insolence had since achieved the rank of captain and been placed in command of a battalion-sized unit in the regiment. At a regimental staff meeting I attended after becoming an officer, the captain exhibited his disdainful attitude toward the enlisted men. When several other officers entered the bunker to join our group, he said with undisguised distaste, "Shut that door. It smells of ordinary people out there." Relatively few officers from aristocratic backgrounds acted so haughtily, but this captain's attitude reflected the importance of class in German society at the time. If someone had a von in front of their last name and was well educated, they would typically sail right through the hiring process when seeking a job. This same sort of favoritism similarly applied in granting military promotions, though the Wehrmacht was not generally a class-based institution in other respects. Once becoming a German officer, you were accorded respect because of your rank rather than because you were a Prussian, a Nazi, or possessed some other privileged background. Interestingly, I never witnessed any particular cultural clash between officers coming from aristocratic Prussian backgrounds and those coming from less privileged circumstances. In my experience, it would be more accurate to say that the aristocrats separated themselves from everyone else, just as they did in civilian life. A couple of weeks into our training, Annalisa surprised me with a telegram announcing her impending arrival in Dresden at the end of December. During this unanticipated but very welcome visit, Annalisa and I crammed as much as we could into our time together. In the couple of days before the New Year's celebration, we wandered through the city's famous rambling Baroque complex of pavilions and galleries called the Zwinger, watched a play at the Opera House, and called on some of my distant relatives. Annalisa and I also dropped by a number of Dresden's jewellers in order to select a shop to craft our engagement rings. Because it was impossible to purchase anything made of gold during the war, the customer had to provide the jeweller with an adequate amount of gold to fashion the desired item. Several weeks after we supplied our collected gold to the jeweller we had settled on, the shop delivered an attractive pair of rings to me. On January 6th, our cadre of officer candidates travelled 25 miles south from Dresden to the mountain resort of Altenburg for a week of training in downhill and cross-country skiing. The evenings included entertainment by a talented troupe of female dancers and a youth choir singing local folk songs, but our daytime recreation was far more demanding. In a scenic winter setting among snow-covered trees, our instructor spent the first couple of days teaching us the basics of downhill skiing. Though I had cross-country skied in Russia, this type of skiing was completely new to me. Once our instruction ended, we headed up to the slopes. Waiting in single file at the top of a ski run, we watched each man in turn disappear from sight, uncertain what lay beyond our view. Finally, the instructor ordered me to push off. Building up speed as my skis carried me down the slope, I came over a hill to confront a ski jump located directly in my path. There was no way to avoid it. Racing down the ramp in a crouch, I was sitting on my leather riding breeches by the time I left the end of the jump, and that was how I crash-landed in the soft snow at the bottom. A couple of days later, our instructors ordered us to ski down an icy bobsled run. On my attempt, I managed to ski about 20 or 30 yards. By that point, I was travelling too fast to navigate the turn. In desperation, I threw my arms around a large tree growing beside the run to keep from breaking my neck. Soon after our return to the academy in Dresden, we were faced with another test of courage. About 10 o'clock one night, our instructors ordered us to put on our swimming trunks and come down to the school's large indoor pool. On our arrival, we lined up at the bottom of the ladder leading to the 33-foot-high diving platform. One at a time, each officer candidate was directed to ascend to the top. Once there, the instructor switched off the lights and ordered the man to jump down into pitch-black darkness. While some of my fellow officer candidates were very hesitant to obey the order, I simply dropped into the pool feet first when my turn came, figuring that our instructors would not seriously endanger the lives of Germany's future officers. With these types of training methods, the German army was instilling an unconditional obedience to orders, whatever obstacles might exist or whatever doubts an individual might possess. Such challenges perhaps also made my promotion to Oberfähnrich, senior officer candidate, on March 1st a little more meaningful. A few days before our training concluded, we learned that Adolf Hitler would personally deliver an address in Dessau to officer candidates from across Germany. Even with my deep discomfort with the Nazi regime, it was impossible not to feel a sense of anticipation during the 100-mile rail trip from Dresden. The subsequent announcement that the Führer would not be able to attend, and that instead Admiral Dönitz, the Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine, German Navy, would speak to us, was met with widespread disappointment. Even with my childhood interest in submarine warfare, I found his oration uninspiring. Back at the Kriegsschule, our graduation on March 15, 1944, involved no fanfare. Instead, the Academy's commanding superintendent simply delivered a short, inspiring speech and wished us well. Though the field training had been of little practical utility and could not begin to match what I had learned through years of combat, the theoretical aspect of our instruction had been interesting and helpful to me as I prepared for a new leadership role. If nothing else, it was simply a relief to have several months away from the bullets and shells at the front. On my arrival in Oldenburg from Dresden the day after graduation, I reported to a captain, who told me to return the following morning. When I finally received my second lieutenant's shoulder boards the next day, I eagerly headed straight to a Wehrmacht tailor to make the necessary changes in my uniform. Although uncertain what lay ahead of me upon my return to the front, I had at last achieved my long-sought ambition to serve as a leader. March 17th, May 13th, 1944. Receiving a 2-week furlough on March 17th, I made the short trip from Oldenburg to Hamburg, anxiously anticipating my imminent engagement to Anneliese. She was already in the middle of a month of leave from her nursing duties and was waiting for me when I arrived. Rather than spending my 3 nights at Herr Bernds' house, I again stayed with Aunt Frieda in Winterhude. However, Anneliese and I took our meals back at her home in Wonsbeck in order to give me an opportunity to spend a little time with her father and her other relatives who lived there. On March 18th, Anneliese and I placed our newly crafted rings on one another's fingers at Aunt Frieda's home. There was no real celebration of the occasion, but we shared the news of our engagement with her father and telephoned my family back in Puggen. In the middle of a war in which our future together was so unsure, Anneliese and I agreed that we should delay our marriage until peace was achieved. Facing a return to the Russian front in a few weeks' time, I did not know if I would even live to see my 24th birthday. Though it was difficult for me to tie another person to my uncertain fate, her promise to marry me would give me a sense of hope in the dark days that lay ahead. While our decision to wait was based solely on our concerns about what might happen in the future, we were also aware that we would need to obtain authorization from the army and other government agencies when we did decide to marry. Beyond the normal bureaucratic red tape, we faced an additional complication because Anneliese's mother possessed the Jewish surname of Salomon. This had been her mother's maiden name as a result of her childhood adoption by the family of a Jewish butcher in Hamburg. When the authorities saw the name, they refused to grant me permission to marry Anneliese without further investigation. Challenging such racial restrictions was impossible, though I did not see how the government had any right to interfere with whom I chose to marry, even if Anneliese had been Jewish. Leaving Hamburg a couple of days after our engagement, Anneliese and I spent the next few days with my family in Puggen. On March 24th, she departed our farm to spend a week at home before reporting for duty in Leer, Germany. After obtaining her orders in Leer on April 4th, she made the 250-mile trip to her newly assigned hospital in Beverlo, Belgium. At the end of March, I travelled 60 miles west to Munster, where I entered a 2-week training course for company commanders. It included additional classroom instruction, as well as field training at a large proving ground nearby. This gave us an opportunity to observe firsthand the performance of new weapons, such as a highly accurate 210mm rocket launcher. Following another 2-week furlough from duty in Puggen, I arrived on April 30th for a week-long course at the Officers' Riding Academy in the town of Soltau, a little west of Munster. Waking at dawn, we began by leading our horses at a trot around and around the sawdust-covered floor of a large building. This was followed by an exercise in which we practiced repeatedly jumping onto the horse's back, while the animal continued to move around the ring. Beyond the constant riding, our instructors also taught us other potentially useful skills, such as how to make a horse lie down in order to shield ourselves in the midst of a firefight. By the end of the second day, areas of the flesh on my buttocks and thighs had become rather disgusting raw wounds. Each night they would crust over before painfully reopening during the following day's riding. Other than this physical discomfort, the experience at Soltau proved generally agreeable. While many of the men found the course arduous, my previous work with horses on our farm made the training relatively undemanding for me. On the completion of this last element of my required officer training on May 8th, I spent 3 days at the 58th Division's reserve base in Oldenburg. To my great satisfaction, Annalisa was able to join me after receiving a short furlough following an Allied bombing raid that had struck her hospital in Beverlo. Although she had not been injured in the attack, the prospect of further air raids nonetheless caused me to grow increasingly concerned for her future safety. During her stay in Oldenburg, we had planned to get a hotel room together. However, when I approached the hotel's manager for a room, he inquired whether we were married. When I responded that we were engaged to be married, he informed me that unmarried couples were not permitted to share a room and instead required us to pay for separate rooms. The war had brought many changes, but it did little to alter Germany's traditionally conservative social conventions. At the end of our brief time together on May 10th, Annalisa returned to Belgium. Shortly after her arrival, she was shifted 20 miles east from Beverlo to the Belgian town of Genk. At the hospital here, she would soon be helping to treat a flood of casualties from France. At the end of a final visit to Puggen from May 10th to 13, I said my goodbyes to my family. Heading back to the Eastern Front as an officer, I had no idea where I would be assigned, nor whether I would ever return home. Little did I anticipate the hammer blows about to befall the Wehrmacht in the following month of June. During the summer of 1944, Germany would face an escalating series of crises that would steadily increase the suffering and hardship at the front and at home. Tilsit, at the border of the German Reich on May 15th, there was a cable waiting for me at the Wehrmacht's Central Leadership Reserve Depot from Colonel Behrend, commander of the 154th Grenadier Regiment. His message requested my return to the regiment to take charge of my old heavy weapons company, replacing the already departed 2nd Lieutenant Reichart. Since I could have been assigned to any company in Army Group North, his appeal for me to receive command of my old unit was excellent news as far as I was concerned, though it was a completely unexpected action over which I had no influence. Granting Behrend's request, the Army promptly issued new orders returning me to the 13th Company. Boarding the next train out of Tilsit, I embarked on the 250-mile trip to rejoin the 58th Division at the front, now located in northeastern Estonia. The journey offered me further time to reflect on developments on the Eastern Front over the previous half-year. In January 1944, the Red Army had executed an offensive that brought an end to our long siege of Leningrad and forced Army Group North into a general retreat to the west. This orderly withdrawal in the northern sector was part of the larger shift in the strategic situation that had taken place after Stalingrad. Although there was no decline in the fighting capability of the individual German soldier, there were ever-increasing personnel losses that Germany could not replace. Meanwhile, the Red Army was steadily increasing its quantitative superiority in manpower and material and regaining its territory lost early in the war. There was hope that by shortening its length of front, the Wehrmacht could in some measure compensate for its inferiority in personnel, while at the same time shortening its own supply lines and lengthening those of the enemy. As the 154th Regiment pulled back to the northwest from Neville with the rest of the 58th Division that winter, it split up into smaller formations in order to conduct a more effective fighting retreat. Under mounting pressure, the detachment of regiments, battalions, and even companies from their larger formations had become more commonplace. With few reserves available, the German army deployed these newly created fire brigades to plug gaps that opened along a fluid front and to respond to other crises. By February 1944, the 154th Regiment had reassembled and joined the 58th Division at a location near Narva in northeastern Estonia, where it took up a position in a previously constructed network of defences that ran between the Baltic coast and Lake Peipus. Operating from this fortified Panther position, the 154th Regiment helped to repulse Red Army attacks around the town of Sirgala, about 15 miles west of Narva, and our old Pleusa battlefield of 1941. Upon my arrival at the 13th Company's position on May 20th, I immediately assumed the role of acting Kompanienführer, company leader. Within a month, Colonel Behrend confirmed me in this position. Normally it would have been held by a captain rather than a second lieutenant, but the desperate shortage of officers had now made my situation relatively common in the German army. As the only officer in the company, I was forced to run my platoons with sergeants who normally commanded squads. Senior Sergeant Juchter was still in charge of the Tross, rear area, and Staff Sergeant Ehlert continued to lead the communications platoon, but now I was their superior. The camaraderie that I once enjoyed with many members of the company as an enlisted man was no longer possible. Addressed as Herr Leutnant, a certain awkward distance appeared between myself and the other long-time veterans of the company like Willi Schutter. Yet, as a result of the discipline and respect for rank instilled by army training, we soon adjusted and became accustomed to the changed relationship. While there was deference to my rank and a distance between us off the battlefield, the old comradeship would return during combat, or if one of them was wounded. My relationship with the men in the 13th Company may have also been helped by the fact that I continued to spend about the same amount of time at the front as the enlisted men. Though there were few casualties in the company during the first 2 months after my return, the intense fighting over the preceding months had reduced the unit to about 200 men. This strength was significantly less than the complement of between 250 and 300 troops we had maintained in the first couple of years of the war in Russia. Fortunately, the relative calm at the Panther position permitted us to restore our depleted strength to some extent, as we received replacements and the return of wounded troops from convalescent leave. The fact that the Wehrmacht drew most of the men filling its divisions from a single region enhanced camaraderie and cohesion within a unit, but it could also lead to significant tension when the army had to send outsiders as replacements, or when units from different regions had to act in close cooperation. While interaction between troops from different regions could lead to problems, a few strangers from outside northern Germany performed very successfully in our company. In particular, an Austrian private first class from Vienna surprisingly proved to be one of the best soldiers I would command in combat. His relaxed manner caused me some initial concern, but he executed orders promptly and always remained calm when the bullets were flying. You could never predict someone's behavior in combat. As an officer, I was issued a Luger pistol for my sidearm. While only firing it a couple of times in combat, it proved a good weapon and fairly accurate up to a range of 20 to 30 yards. Later, I obtained a Spanish-made Astra Model 600 pistol that would serve as my favoured sidearm. In some instances, I also carried a Mauser rifle or MP40 submachine gun, though I preferred the rifle in action due to its much greater range and accuracy. With my new rank, I acquired the services of a soldier who took care of my clothes and delivered my meals from the company field kitchen. The company had few motor vehicles, but there was a Citroën at my disposal, and fortunately, a designated enlisted man to serve as my driver. Because my family had not possessed an automobile or truck when I was growing up, I had never learned to drive nor obtained a license. My position also entitled me to make use of a horse named Thea and receive the services of her handler, although I would seldom ride her unless we were on the march and conditions were quiet. With a farming background, my knowledge of horses often proved greater than that of the soldiers charged with their care. On one occasion, when a sergeant was experiencing trouble taming a particular horse, I leapt up on it and rode around in circles until the horse became submissive. Despite my responsibilities of command, Annalisa remained constantly on my mind. While suffering many difficult and painful experiences as a soldier, the worst part of the war for me was my separation from her and the uncertainty of whether we would ever see each other again. Our letters were filled with expressions of our yearning to see each other, our wish to marry, and our desire to enjoy a normal life. Beyond conveying our love to one another, we also shared the hope that the war would soon end. In the face of ever darker news, we sought to reinforce each other's morale about the outcome. Working as a nurse in Belgium, Annalisa mentioned her frequent sightings of the massed bomber formations flying overhead on the way from England to Germany or on their return. Having witnessed the horrible fate of Hamburg, she would wonder which city would next face devastation. She also conveyed news from her correspondence and phone conversations with my brother Otto, who was posted relatively nearby her in France. Soon after the long-anticipated landings by the Western Allies on June 6, 1944, she and my family became greatly concerned when they lost touch with him. 3 months of uncertainty passed before they finally received a note from the Red Cross, indicating Otto had become a POW following his capture on August 30th. Yet, though my anxiety over my brother's fate eventually lifted, my concern for Annaliese's safety only intensified, especially when I learned that the area around her hospital in Genk had been bombed in mid-June. Mid-July, August 7th, 1944. There had been only limited action along the Narva sector of the Panther position since my arrival in late May, but an urgent crisis on the Eastern Front soon developed to the south. On June 22nd, the third anniversary of our invasion of Russia, the Red Army commenced a massive offensive that virtually annihilated Army Group Center, killing or capturing hundreds of thousands of German troops. The destruction of one of the Wehrmacht's 3 army groups was a strategic disaster, at least equal to Stalingrad, that gravely undermined Germany's entire position on the Eastern Front. With the southern flank of Army Group North almost unprotected, the High Command rapidly assembled units from around the Northern Front to deploy down to southern Latvia in mid-July. As we were preparing to pull out of the Narva area, the division supplied my company with about 24 210mm rockets. These were capped with a variety of different warheads, including one type that spread small steel ball bearings dispersed by a high explosive, another variety that spread shrapnel dispersed by an explosive compressed air canister, and a third that used an incendiary naphtha material. With our departure imminent, it was necessary to expend or destroy any remaining ordnance that would have been difficult to haul with us, in order to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. After witnessing a test firing of these rockets a few months earlier at the company commander's course in Munster, I was also simply interested to assess their combat effectiveness. Lacking the necessary equipment to fire the rockets, I came up with the idea of using their shipping crates as launching tubes. Working behind a hill that hid us from enemy surveillance, we constructed 2 sets of simple wooden supports and then chopped down a couple of 5-inch diameter trees for crossbeams. Leaning one of the shipping crates against a crossbeam at the appropriate firing angle, we aimed the ersatz launcher by sight at a target in the Soviet lines. After connecting one of the rocket's electric trigger mechanisms to a hand-operated electrical detonator normally used to set off mines, we carefully loaded the weapon into the improvised launching tube. On ignition, it flashed through the air and exploded right on target. Following this success, I issued orders to similarly prepare our entire stock of rockets for launching, setting their built-in timing mechanisms in order to produce a short delay between each rocket's firing. When the detonator handle was twisted, the rockets began racing across no man's land to their designated targets on the edge of a nearby woods. In an awesome display of concentrated firepower, the explosive warheads' detonations tossed trees into the air, while the incendiary warheads instantly ignited a blaze across a wide swath of forest. Though we were uncertain exactly what Russian forces were arrayed across from us, these rockets had obliterated whatever was there. With the proper launching devices, the rockets would have been highly effective weapons, but we never received any further supplies. Leaving the Panther position, the 58th Division transferred about 100 miles west to Reval, Estonia. Generally, we moved these longer distances by train and shorter distances by horse or by foot. Despite some attempt to motorize the 58th Division during the course of the war, the process had been very inconsistent. While lacking any trucks when we fought in France, the Wehrmacht subsequently issued us a number of Bedford trucks captured from the Allies after that campaign had ended. From about the end of 1942, we began to receive a large number of German-made motorized vehicles in Russia. This effort to motorize our division soon halted, and we received no further vehicles after mid-1943. Once the army stopped supplying us with new vehicles, we thought it somewhat amusing to find ourselves increasingly on horses once again, as our existing trucks were destroyed or immobilized from a lack of spare parts. Motorization had mixed results in the conditions we experienced in the Soviet Union. When the spring and fall Rasputitsas, rainy seasons, turned many Russian roads into a mud resembling quicksand, horses sometimes proved superior to trucks. Often the mud was so deep that our panzers would have to haul the trucks out. Even in good weather, you could never drive very fast on primitive roads while hauling a 150mm howitzer. On reflection, I believe that many commentators have overestimated the significance of our lack of mechanization, especially once Germany had been placed on the strategic defensive. Horses did not require petrol for fuel nor steel and industrial plants to be produced, so in this sense helped preserve Germany's resources for more vital weapons and ammunition. Whatever the relative merits of horse-drawn versus motorized transportation, our division was again relying almost exclusively on horses to haul our guns and other equipment by the time I returned to the front in mid-1944. Soon after arriving in Reval, our division made the 150-mile journey by train south to Dunaburg, located beside the Duna River in Latvia. At the end of a 30-mile march west to the town of Rokiskis in neighboring Lithuania, we engaged in an intense battle with advancing Soviet forces on July 17th, but failed to hold the city. Adopting a defensive posture, we entrenched in a nearby position about 75 miles southeast of Riga, Latvia. Though no longer a forward observer, I continued to operate close to the front as an officer. Confident of my horsemanship, I probably also took some unnecessary risks. On a quiet day, I decided to take Thea out for some exercise, but ended up straying too close to the enemy's position. Suddenly, bullets began whizzing through the air around us. It was a scary moment for me, particularly since captured Russians had told us that Red Army troops had standing orders to shoot first at those German soldiers who wore the form-fitting pants and boots typical of German officers. Swinging Thea around, I jumped her over a fence and galloped to the rear. Once again, my life had been spared. In addition to visually monitoring the enemy's front lines, we listened for any change in the volume or type of noise emitted from their position. Sometimes the change was subtle, but at other times it was obvious. At our first position close to Rokiskis, the sound of female laughter echoed across no man's land. Calling back to our guns, I ordered a few rounds be dropped in that direction. Following the short barrage, the front became completely silent. Late one night soon afterward, a sudden torrent of heavy machine gun fire erupted from our front lines about 50 yards ahead of my bunker. Confirming my suspicions, an infantryman arrived moments later to report that a Soviet attack was coming directly toward our position. With our troops in urgent need of fire support, I moved outside the bunker and contacted the teams manning our 3 105mm mortars, aware that the vertical trajectory of their fire made them more effective than our howitzers among the Duna's tall trees. Uncertain how close the Russian assault had penetrated, my initial orders directed a barrage of mortar rounds into an area about 100 yards to our front. When several salvos produced no diminishment in the intensity of the battle, I pulled the curtain of shells 50 yards nearer to us. The concentration of fire from our machine guns immediately made it clear, however, that the enemy had advanced even closer. Cutting the range back to coordinates 25 yards ahead of our front line, I ordered a final bombardment, fearing that any further reduction might risk hitting our own troops. As the mortar rounds slammed into a rectangular zone roughly 25 by 75 yards, the Soviet assault was finally halted. Rather than spreading out as they normally would in a daylight attack, the Red Army troops had clustered together in the darkness, amplifying the deadly results of our barrage. Our infantry later told me that just one of these rounds alone had killed 10 to 20 Russians. The total enemy death toll from the 30 or so mortar shells must have been in the dozens. One afternoon a few days later, I was resting in my bunker about 100 yards behind the front. Oberstleutnant Werner Ebeling, who had just become the acting regimental commander, entered and asked, "Lübecker, do you have something to drink?" Pleased to have a chance to talk with him, I grabbed a bottle of cognac from under my bunk. Almost immediately, 3 more officers I knew from the regimental staff appeared and demanded, "Is that all you have?" Happy to share my stock, I produced additional bottles. The problem with this situation was the German custom of toasting. When a toast is made, everyone present must empty their glasses, turning them upside down as proof of their consumption. At the end of a long afternoon of toasts, we were all so drunk that we could barely walk. Departing the bunker, we somehow stumbled the 1.5 miles back to the Tross, no doubt resembling a bunch of drunken sailors. Locating our quartermaster, we obtained a barrel of salted herring and ate the fish right out of the top of it. My impression is that we eventually wandered back up to the front, but I was too drunk to recall exactly. The following day, my head was aching with one of the worst hangovers I had ever experienced. For the rest of my life, I have not been able to smell cognac without feeling ill. August 7th, October 5th, 1944. Shortly after our drinking party, advances by the Red Army threatened the German forces near Rokiskis with encirclement, forcing us to make our first major retreat in the Duna region on August 7th. Withdrawing to the northwest over the course of the next couple of days, the 180 or so remaining men in my company established a new position near the western turn in the Nemunelis-Memele River. This placed us about 40 miles northwest of Rokiskis and roughly the same distance southeast of Riga. When we reached our new position, I ordered a single round to be fired at a particular set of coordinates to our front, as was standard procedure. When our howitzer boomed behind me, I waited for the expected explosion in our front. Instead, there was a blast right behind me, and I realized that the shell had fallen short. Immediately afterward, an enlisted man came running up to our position yelling, "Those sons of bitches! They shot me!" Uncertain whether the misfire resulted from a mistake on my part in calculating the range or an error by the gun crew, I did not volunteer that I might have been to blame for this incidence of friendly fire. Luckily, the man's wound was slight and no one else was injured. As August progressed, the situation on the Duna front grew more fluid, and we were increasingly on the move. Red Army attacks across a wide front against outnumbered German troops led to the increasing use of ad hoc fire brigades assigned to block Russian penetrations. Their effective deployment was hampered by uncertainty as to whether the enemy was in front of us, to the side of us, or to our rear. To avoid being outflanked and encircled, there was ultimately no alternative but for the whole front line to steadily pull back. Acting as one of these emergency fire brigades, our heavy weapons company sometimes occupied an area of the front separate from our regimental infantry, or even in support of units from another division. While none of the main Soviet assaults struck our company's sector of the front, we frequently engaged in numerous smaller combat actions. Whereas in offensive operations we used our guns to reduce the capability of the Soviet forces to resist an advance, in defensive actions we sought to break up concentrations of Red Army forces before they advanced or during an attack. When this failed, we sought to limit the enemy's ability to closely follow our retreat. When orders came to pull out of a position, our gun company was always the first part of the regiment to pull out, since we required more time to load our equipment and also travelled more slowly. The regiment would leave a rearguard of the 2 or 3 infantry squads with machine guns, supported by a couple of 75mm howitzers, or 105mm mortars from our company. When this infantry rearguard pulled back, the remaining gun crews received little time to load their equipment and get on the road ahead of the pursuing Russians. Throughout the Baltic region, there were a few large depots where the Wehrmacht had accumulated enormous quantities of supplies to support the operations of Army Group North. These stores of war materials and food often had to be hastily destroyed or simply abandoned because of the speed of the Red Army advance. Frequently, there were large clouds of black smoke billowing up into the sky behind the front lines, just before we retreated. The loss of these depots caused certain types of supplies to grow tighter, but it also meant that we sometimes received delivery of large amounts of rare luxuries. In one instance, the army sent our division numerous bottles of Hennessy cognac that would otherwise have been lost. Under the constant threat of a Soviet attack, there were few opportune moments to allow the men to drink freely. Now more alert than ever to the dangers posed by excessive drinking, I kept the liquor supplies tightly rationed. At a location further along in our retreat through the Duna region, There was a rare occasion when the divisional artillery coordinated with our heavy weapons company to jointly strike a target. While our heavy weapons company supported the regimental infantry's operations closer to the front, the artillery normally concentrated on targets in the enemy's rear area. The forward observer for the regiment's heavy gun company typically worked in close proximity and often exchanged ideas with his counterpart in the division's main artillery regiment, but their distinct fire support missions meant that they almost always operated independently. In this particular instance, our division's intelligence had become suspicious that the Red Army was massing forces in a roughly 10-acre wooded area to our front. To destroy whatever was there, the artillery command requested our company to join them in a barrage on the Soviet position. With my long experience as an FO, it was possible for me to calculate almost down to the second how long it would take for the shells from our howitzers and mortars to reach a particular target. Coordinating with the artillery's FO, we sought to precisely time our barrages in order to deliver the maximum possible intensity of fire on the unsuspecting Soviet forces hidden in the forest. Orchestrating the barrage from our guns by my watch, I first ordered the firing of our 105mm mortars, because it takes longer for their rounds to reach the target due to their high trajectory. This was closely followed by the firing of all of our 150mm and 75mm howitzers. In about half a minute or so, hundreds of shells from our guns and the artillery simultaneously slammed into the woods. This devastating cataclysm of fire undoubtedly annihilated any Russian forces that might have been massing there. In such circumstances, it was impossible not to feel pity for the enemy. A few lines from a series of letters to Annalisa during our steady retreat that August exposes my darkening mood at the Duna. With an almost fatalistic attitude about the future, I wrote, "You and I will fulfill our duties to the end." With survival uncertain, I penned, "God willing, we'll see each other again." Yet our love left me with hope that I expressed to her with the words, "I am grateful to have you, dear Annalie." When she sent me a lock of curls from her hair in a letter at the end of August, I placed them in my breast pocket as a talisman. Meanwhile, the speed of the Allied advance through France and into Belgium forced a sudden evacuation of her field hospital in Genk on September 8, 1944. In the chaos that followed, the medical personnel had to make their own escape. After hitching a ride back to Germany, Annalisa received a temporary leave from her nursing duties. Because of the air raids on Hamburg, she went to stay at my family's farm in Puggen until she was called back to service. About this time, refugees fleeing the Soviet threat in the east and the bombing raids on the larger German cities began to appear in Puggen and other rural areas in greater numbers. My family welcomed distant relatives into our home from all over Germany, but there were also many strangers who knew no one in Puggen. Perhaps because of my family's long antagonistic relations with the Nazis, the local authorities assigned 20 or so of these refugees to our farm. Every unoccupied room in the house was turned over to the refugees. Lacking enough beds, my family piled straw for the guests to sleep on. To help meet the need for food, my family even butchered some of our pigs. The presence of refugees placed an especially heavy daily burden on my mother, who worked hard to make sure that everyone was provided with cooked meals and other basic needs. Despite my family's lack of Nazi sympathies, my sisters were pressured to attend regular meetings of the Bund Deutscher Mädchen, or BDM, League of German Girls, the Nazis' female youth organization, in what apparently was an intentional attempt to prevent the girls from attending church services. The BDM held these sessions on Sunday mornings. While my sisters were on their way to a meeting in a neighboring village late in the war, a low-flying Allied aircraft suddenly appeared and began strafing everything on a nearby road, causing my sisters to spring for cover in a ditch. There were similar stories of Allied fighter planes breaking away from the bombers to attack people working in the fields. Although the rural areas in Germany escaped the Anglo-American bombing raids that targeted cities, even there residents did not completely escape death from the sky. On both fronts, the war was drawing steadily closer to the fatherland, and no one would be left untouched.